Alright, good morning class. It's Friday, end of the first week of the winter session argumentation class. We are blazing through this thing. I'm going to cover both chapters 3 and 4 today, and I'm also going to talk about the exam, which I'll be uploading to Blackboard immediately after finishing these lectures. And let's get right into it. So chapter 3 is probably one of the most straightforward and accessible of all the chapters. It's pretty clear what's being suggested here. You can just read it for what it's worth. Basically, as I said earlier, one of my approaches to teaching argument, which I think is absent in a lot of other books, is that they focus on the arguments and they focus on the audiences in terms of effects and persuasion, but they don't tend to focus on judges, and by that I mean the characteristics or qualities of the person or group that the arguer is creating the argument for. In other words, when you argue or you create arguments, you do that with the judge in mind. You have in mind somebody who is going to judge your argument in a particular way. This is why it's so often important for advocates to find out who in fact their judges are. You'll hear attorneys all the time talk about this or that judge is very conservative or very liberal or very rules-based or a stickler for procedure. And that's part of knowing who you're arguing in front of and making the appropriate adjustments argumentatively to make your strategy acceptable. A lot of my thinking about judging and how arguments are judged comes from my years of experience as a debate coach and a debate judge, and knowing that going to many different debate tournaments around the country, that my teams would be encountering different people from different schools who saw debates very differently and who judged them very differently. So using that, I tried to lay out some of what I think are the most famous, common types of judges. And the first one, of course, that I identified is the one that's most regularly talked about, and that's the judge called the Tabula Rasa. This is the idea. A lot of judges in courtrooms will tell you that this is how they judge arguments, that they go into the case and they are a blank slate, literally. That's what Tabula Rasa means. And they have no prejudgment, no preconception, no prejudice. They're acting as if they're just a very educated but ignorant person about the facts of this case. And they're not going to enter the case, and they're not going to help one side or the other, or put arguments into the trial or the issue that are not explicitly laid out by one side or the other. This is kind of, I would say, the paradigm for virtually all other judging that people claim to do impartial or fair judging. That's just the first type of judge. The second is I call a policymaker. This is where a judge hears a debate or hears an argument and thinks about his or her role in making the decision. In other words, he or she will enter the controversy because they know how to evaluate it. So, for example, let's say you had a whole group of engineers and they were hearing a proposal about how to solve a wastewater problem in a community. The engineers are not going to be a tabula rasa. They're not going to check their knowledge at the door. They're not going to say, well, I don't know anything about engineering. So if they hear one group propose something that's patently absurd and the other side propose something that sounds like it will work, and the evidence and arguments are marshaled to support the second rather than first, this group of experts is going to weigh in based on their knowledge, and they will enter the controversy and make a judgment that way. So you can think about a lot of scientific and technical sorts of decisions, or maybe decisions in government, are made this way, where people are schooled on the subject. So if they feel that something's ludicrous or doesn't really work as a policy option. They will enter the debate in terms of their expertise. The next type of judge is the critic. This is the judge who sees argument as primarily an artistic activity. I have to admit that this is partially me. I mean, I'm somebody who's taught public speaking, debate, persuasion, argumentation, all these communication studies courses my whole career, and so I've seen the best and worst examples of everything. I've seen things that are beautifully done, beautifully executed, people who are almost like virtuosos at communicating and arguing. I've seen debaters do really beautiful things, and this is the way that a lot of people respond to debate. So, for example, you're watching an argument and you say things like, that guy is very eloquent, or his style is terrific, or he really expressed that well, or the way he expressed that sentiment really tugged at my heartstring. In other words, you got beyond just the facts and the evidence and the argument and the reasoning, and you looked at the aesthetic response, meaning the artistic or response to the object as if it's a work of art or a performance, and that certainly is the case. And by the way, I should point out as a historical fact that public speaking and argument and debate for many centuries, going back to antiquity, was just another form of artistic expression and performance, which was evaluated the way today we evaluate plays and concerts and movies. I mean, those other things didn't always exist, so there were other dimensions to the performing arts, and public speaking was part of it. And even today, when you go to see a stand-up comedian, you're basically seeing somebody who is a public speaker who's being judged on the quality of their performance. The next judge is what I call the educator. This is a person who watches an argument and decides how much, or makes a decision or makes a judgment based on how much he or she could teach the advocates about how to do this so much better. Obviously, again, this is part of my orientation as somebody who teaches this. For example, when I have judged debates at tournaments, which I've done for over 30 years, sometimes I'll see somebody who's just doing something that is self-destructive. It's wrong. It's not going to work. It's not going to be helpful to them. It's not going to lead to their enjoyment of the activity or their improvement in the activity. And so, by way of critique or evaluating them as a debater, I'm going to give them advice about you should do this but not do that, and so forth. The next judge I call the theorist. This is a person who is looking at the broader philosophical or theoretical implications of the debate that's being had in front of them. So in other words, let's say we were debating about whether or not all colleges should accept the credits from every other college. So for example, if you were transferring from NKU to Harvard, should Harvard have to accept every credit that you earned at NKU? Or, for that matter, vice versa. If you were studying at Harvard and transferred to NKU, should NKU have to accept every credit that you earned? Okay, so the theorist could say, well, you know, there's a bigger issue here than just that particular issue, and the bigger issue is here. What does an education mean? What does it mean to be liberally educated or generally educated? If you have a bachelor's degree from NKU or you have a bachelor's degree from Harvard, are those roughly equivalent things? Are we saying that these two people with these two degrees represent the same kind of level of educational attainment? Do they have the same general knowledge? Can they speak with intelligence about the same thing? So the theorist will basically say, forget about that specific issue. Who's doing a better idea of defending the principles of a liberal education? And so they will look at that. The jurist is a judge who is committed to protecting the process. So this is like the judge in a courtroom. So this is a person who is concerned with procedure, with rules, with precedent, with what laws or regulative activities govern the argumentative process. This is a person who could award a decision in an argument or a debate based on just a technicality where they just see somebody's done something wrong, and so everything else that the other side has done is granted legitimacy, or everything that the side that committed the violation done is wiped away because it's so overarchingly important to follow the rules. A great example of this is, again, in a courtroom. A lawyer will ask a question or say something that's simply not permitted. Now the jury has heard it, and the judge can't roll back what the jury heard. So you've often seen in movies and television depictions of trials that the judge will say something like, please disregard what the attorney just said, it's not relevant to the case. But the fact of the matter is, they did hear it, and it's very hard to undo what they've heard. And oftentimes in movies, they just go ahead and finish the trial. But a lot of times in real trials, things that the jury hears or is exposed to that prejudice the case or damage the fairness of the process actually void the process and result in a mistrial, meaning they have to start the trial over or cancel the trial. Okay, a politician is a person who judges an argument in terms of what we call expediency. There's some itch that has to be scratched, an urgent matter that has to be addressed. And so the efficacy of a policy or what stands against a policy in arguing for it is decided on political grounds. So think about it. Let's say you lived in a neighborhood where there was water leaking out from the sewer onto the street. You might say that what's required is a long-term study to determine why that's happening, right? But the fact of the matter is, sewage is coming out on the street. It's posing a health risk. It's there. It's an annoyance. It smells. People who live in the neighborhood don't like it, and they want it to stop immediately. So the debate will be about how the best way is to stop this right now, despite what the cause is. As a matter of fact, the thing that you might do to solve or fix it might actually create more problems down the line. I don't know if you remember the famous story of that oil leak that was happening in the Gulf of Mexico. It happened several years ago during the first term of the Obama presidency, and they were talking about things they had to do short term while they tried to figure out on a long-term basis what was causing the leak and how to stop the leak. And some of the things for the short term were maybe addressing things immediately, but people were saying, we're not addressing the long-term consequences, so the problem's worse. But the politician would be focused more on the short-term or the efficacy issue rather than the long-term, especially if you could document there's some problem that exists right now that we can deal with. Maybe not in perpetuity, but at least for the time being. Finally, the scientist. This is a person whose judgment is based largely on evidence or data-based inferences. In other words, to use the methodology of science to answer almost any question. You'd be surprised to learn that this is used, for example, in court cases much more than you might think. You might not think of court cases as a kind of scientific environment. You might think that they're more about advocacy and argument and style and emotion and people doing tricks or enacting strategies. But a lot of the constraints on evidence that's presented in course are the constraints of science. So what's permissible, what's not permissible, what's allowed, what's not allowed, what counts, what doesn't count, what's expert, what's non-expert. Those are all very important. I mean, you probably heard all the stuff that occurred recently with Ferguson and the riots. Well, the grand jury report had all the forensic evidence that the grand jury was able to see about what transpired and what it meant in terms of what might have actually happened, and that seems to be a large part of what the grand jury used in reaching their decision. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about philosophies of judgment. So my mini lecture on Chapter 3 is pretty much concluded with that, and I'm going to move on to Chapter 4. Thanks for listening.